I'm recording this one ahead of time because I'll be going to Africa soon. So I haven't got feedback yet on Monday Moments for this format. But please let me know what you think. We're going to be talking about the Gospels today. Interpreting the Gospels, one of the most basic thing for the four Gospels is that they recount the life of Jesus. However, it would be a mistake to think that the Gospels are of the same format as a modern biography, because modern biographies, like if you're reading the biography of Billy Graham, what you'll see is he starts at his pre-birth. A lot of times it talks about his family and how he was born into that family and his childhood all the way to his death. Many times, unless it's written beforehand, it goes till when it is written, that person's life, that time period. But Jesus's biography, which is what the Gospels are, the Christological biographies, they do it differently. They talk about the birth of Jesus and then they skip to the ministry of Jesus. They don't really talk about the 30 years before he started his mission. And so that's very important to understand that they're similar to ancient biographies, but they are not the same. And they arrange their biographies topically, basically, instead of chronologically, going through the years of a person's life. And many times, not many times, obviously, what we see is what they focus on is the end of Jesus's life, where he is the Passion Week, which we're coming up to here. Easter's about a month away. And so they really focus on the last week days of Jesus's life. Evangelion. This is where we get the word evangelist from. The gospel means good news, the spreading of the good news. In ancient Greek, what would happen is they would talk about the good news of a military victory or a political victory. But when Jesus comes on the stage, the term changes because it's about Jesus proclaiming it himself as the good news, or being the good news about Jesus that others are proclaiming. Synoptic Gospels. You probably heard this word before. Synoptic means seen together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Synoptic Gospels. John has a whole different flavor. He starts differently, and many times he does everything. It just has a whole different take on the life of Jesus. And so the Synoptic Gospels are, remember, they're not trying to be chronological, they're trying to go around a particular theme. So, but the four gospel writers could not record everything that was to tell about Jesus. And John tells us this: Jesus did many things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that could be or would be written. This is not hyperbole. This is not an exaggeration. Those 3 years were jam packed with Jesus fulfilling the mission and showing who God the Father is for the Jews and the Gentiles. Here is an example of the Synoptic Gospels. You see Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they tell all of these stories of Jesus healing and fasting question, Jairus and his daughter's healing, and they all tell them, whereas John does not. Here's a trivia question for you. What miracle is in all four of the Gospels? So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do you know? It's the feeding of the 5,000. John includes that. They are Christological biographies, and that's how they are different. Their purpose is to teach about the mission and person of Jesus Christ. So they felt free to summarize the teachings of Jesus. They arranged the events around particular themes rather, as I said before, being chronological. And this is what sometimes messes people up because they're like, oh, the Bible contradicts itself. No, it doesn't. You have to understand what each of these individuals' purposes were and who they were writing these biographies to. Matthew's writing to the Jews, Mark's writing to the Gentiles for Peter, and Luke is writing to Theophilus and the Greeks. And so to understand who they're writing to and why they include the things that they do. The four gospel writers arranged events around a particular event, right? And instead of the chronological order, because they wanted to present a faithful yet relevant account in a persuasive manner to who Jesus was. So, what is the framework for reading the Gospels? Well, a lot of times what happens is they have smaller stories that could connect. Oh, like we just mentioned, Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of bleeding. Those two stories have so many correlations. I encourage you to read them. So, what you want to ask yourself is, what does this small story tell us about Jesus? And what is the gospel writer trying to say by the way he puts these small stories together? Those are the interpretive questions you want to ask yourself. And what helps me is that I look at sometimes it's 3 episodes, but sometimes it's 2. Episode 1, what is this episode telling us about Jesus? Episode 2, what is this telling us about Jesus? And then I ask myself, okay, what is this gospel writer trying to communicate to his readers? First audience, original audience, and then me. I'm always second, by the way he connects these stories together. A great example of this is Luke 10, 25 through 37, Luke 10, 38 through 42, and then Luke 11, 1 through 13. I'll repeat those. If you want to go and study and see if you can find the connection of these smaller stories, they were purposeful. They were trying to communicate a theme. Luke 10, 25 through 37, Luke 10, 38 through 42, and Luke 11, 1 through 13. And remember, there weren't chapter and verses when they were writing these. So the original audience would have understood what he was trying to convey to them. So sometimes you have an individual story. There aren't smaller stories put together. So when you're reading an individual story, you go back to the things that you learned in school: the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. What is the interpretive thing that we are trying to gain from this story? So often the gospel writers, when they do an individual story, they'll use repetition. A perfect example of this is John 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. There is so much repetition in that, so that we are supposed to glean, and the original audience would have gleaned from that. Another one is this. Sometimes there's where you have an individual story and then it shifts to discourse, and Jesus is giving a discourse to them. A perfect example of this is Jesus calming the storm, instructing the disciples. So that's like Mark 4:35, I think, is where that begins. And so understand that that's an individual story, and they use repetition, and a lot of times it shifts to a discourse, and that's the main point that you are supposed to get. How to read a series of stories. Look for connections, like I said, right? Common themes, cause and effect, all the things we've learned previously. Transitions, differences between stories, the role of the key character or key characters, right? Zacchaeus. What's the role of Zacchaeus in that story? Right? What are they doing by stringing those stories together that we are supposed to call from them and see, oh, this is the point. I keep trying to use my clicker and it doesn't work on this format. How to read a series of stories. Also, you want to pay attention to all those literary figures of speech that we learned already. Jesus was a master at exaggeration. Think about what he says, It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, right? Exaggeration, hyperbole. He uses metaphor, he uses simile. Oh, he's also uses narrative irony all the time. He's trying to say, he's trying to say, I am sorry about that. He wants us to understand that there is a contrast in what he is saying to what the actual situation is. He asks rhetorical questions, and there is parallelism. We didn't talk about this a lot, but there's parallelism. So if there are two phrases that seem to go together, there's three different forms of parallelism, but he uses that a lot. So this statement and this statement, if it seems to connect, that pay attention to that. The last thing is one of Jesus's favorite techniques was a parable. The New Testament is filled with parables. So a story with two levels of meaning. And there were certain details that would represent something. I'm sure you can think of a parable, your favorite parable, right off the top of your head. So an important fact is that Jesus, when he would share parables, he was talking to the believers who mostly spoke Aramaic at that time, right? And so then when it's in the New Testament, it's in Greek. So you have to understand that the original audience would have understood exactly what Jesus was saying. It's hard for us to understand parables sometimes, but the original audience would have known exactly what Jesus was saying. So the key interpretive rule is look for one main point per character. What is Jesus saying? And when he's telling that parable, that we're supposed to get a main point for each character. Here's an example. The prodigal son, right? Maybe that was the one you thought of right off the top of your head. That's a famous one, right? So, what is the main point of the rebellious son? What is the main point of the forgiving father? What is the main point of the resentful brother? And to be honest, a lot of times I identify with a resentful brother, and especially in the past when I was judgmental, I was a Pharisee, I would resonate with a resentful brother more than the rebellious son. Oh, but the grace of God. And now that I'm on the latter half of my life, I understand. Yeah, I understand. And now I identify with the rebellious son. Oh, but the grace of God, there go I. And then here's another one. The one of my favorites was the Samaritan, right? The Good Samaritan. What's the main point that the authors are trying, that Jesus was trying to get across by the man beaten by the robbers? Okay, and what was he trying to get across by the Jewish religious leaders? And then the Good Samaritan. What is the main point that he is trying to get across to the original audience and us about this parable? They would have understood exactly. And that's why a lot of them they started following him, those who identified. And then the religious leaders, that's why they got even more mad, and to the point of what? Killing him, because they understood exactly what he was saying by the parable. So why did Jesus speak in parables? D.A. Carson, a scholar, and he has two YouTube videos that talk about why did Jesus speak in parables. I encourage you to watch those, and because of time's sake, that we can go through these things together. I pray blessings upon you. Spring has sprung. Yes, and I pray that this will be a season of blessing, a season of discovering more of who Jesus is as we get closer to the Passion Week.